Hi, and welcome to the next in this series of Fireside Chats for the Open Publishing Festival, where we're talking to people about the journeys that have brought them to places where they're working on open science, open publishing, and open systems. My guest is Kaitlin Thaney, who is the founding executive director of Invest in Open. So I guess to start with, can you explain to us what Invest in Open is? And what does that mean you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Thanks, Cameron. So Invest in Open was started out of a number of different movements in the broader space over the past few years, not only in terms of in a reaction to some of the broader commercialization of open infrastructure in the scholarly and research ecosystems, but also coming out of some conversations in 2018 from the Joint Roadmap of Open Science Tools conference. We're really a number of like-minded individuals, but also different voices in this space, from infrastructure providers to other projects, services, coalitions, advocacy groups, got together and started to dig into some of the broader sustainability challenges for moving these projects forward. Invest in Open was created as a result of that, and with some additional initial funding from Schmidt Futures and the Sloan Foundation, really brought this into being in the last few months. I've been on the job in the last few weeks, since mid-March. And what IOI is aiming to do is to really create a global strategic body to not only coordinate a number of these conversations around sustainability of open infrastructure for research and also for scholarship, but also to serve as a means of providing targeted research and help in decision makers make more informed choices around how to support and sustain the tools that they rely on.
So what are we really talking about when we're talking about infrastructures and open infrastructures in this space? Or do we know that yet?
It's a great question. And since joining IOI and also building off of the work that had been done by a number of steering committee members before sort of formally joined as the first employee, there are a number of different elements, I think, and understandings as to where to start. If you ask some, when it comes to open infrastructure, it is the citation knowledge graph. It is the underlying information that makes all of scholarship possible. Areas in which, we've, for a very long time in higher ed and also in broader research enterprises, been paying other entities to tell us essentially what we are producing. And so there are elements of that level of infrastructure, as well as the standards and the protocols. There's also the service layer. And so in terms of, how we access content, how we, do broader analysis, we collaborate and, produce information all the way through archival and preservation. IOI was started with a broad remit intentionally so that we can start to probe at some of these broader questions and understand the dependencies and underlying assumptions that exist there, as well as start to identify what potentially collective action to converge on open services and tools may look like more comprehensively.
And I guess it's a moment now when we're thinking about things being open and available and wondering whether we have the services and systems in place to actually get information to where it might need to be, and maybe trusted information where it needs to be.
It is really, I think I'm based here in Brooklyn, New York. My first day at Invest in Open was also when the city went into lockdown. And so really understanding not only that radical shift towards the need and the necessity for open access to information and also data and other outputs, but also, what that means for how this landscape is fundamentally shifting. And so I think, the cases that we've been making for, in many cases, 15, 20 years about the need for more increased access and transparency, interoperability, an understanding of how these systems interact with one another, and community-owned and operated infrastructure. We're starting to see that not only hit a national and international stage based on the demands and the needs arising from the pandemic, but also starting to really see that system under strain as we start to hit it in various ways with research shifting completely online for areas that wasn't necessarily as reliant on before, universities with teaching and learning, all of the sorts of things you've been reading about in the news. So I think it's a really fascinating time to watch that landscape transform.
And I guess that thing about information, trusted information, in a sense, goes right back to where you started, because your original training was in journalism.
That is true. I started as a crime reporter at the Boston Globe way back in the early 2000s, and was really at that point looking at ways in which, from a First Amendment lens, as well as being able to cut my teeth and put that degree to use, what sort of ways we could increase the understanding for others. In that case, a very visceral way of helping to, make the news more broadly available for the city of Boston. But that kind of set me on a trajectory to really think about information in new ways.
And what was there a particular event that pushed you towards the idea of science and open science more generally?
There was. So I had gone to school not only for journalism and was working at the Globe at that time, but also was working on a number of things that I think probably best, in retrospect, identify around the cyber law issues. This was early Larry Lessig timeframe, which is another sort of segment of that. But also in terms of media law and First Amendment work, had started to probe at some of the broader issues there around the intersection of, the right to information and what was available. Also, uniquely at that time, a very close friend of mine was diagnosed with a degenerative muscle disease in the city of Boston. And being a, crime reporter that was very, I guess, tenacious at the time, I had said, let me see what we can find and what information we can find. He was coming up against all of the same access issues that we often speak about, open access and open data and open science being there to counter. And there also were issues with other family members hitting the same lack of information, lack of access. And so I had the opportunity to start working with a professor at MIT, Hal Abelson, which was around the time that they were also thinking about issues around what could Creative Commons do for science and for research. And unbeknownst to many, our initial test audience for the work we were doing at Science Commons ended up being in the rare and neglected disease research communities, trying to combat these issues and employ shared models so that we could start to better understand that. And so that kind of set me off into a space in the early 2000s to work on not only expanding access for people that I really cared about personally, but also more broadly as a result.
I guess looking back at that time, the founding of work on Science Commons, I guess the development of the open access movement, but I guess the access initiative around the same time. Looking back, is there anything you would like to be telling yourself about could have done at the time, or had things stood the test of time?
It's a great question, because I was having this conversation with one of my former colleagues recently, and there are a number of elements that, we were digging into for the right reasons that took about 10 years for that to gain more traction. In some cases, slightly more, maybe 10 to 15 years. For example, we were working on open access when it was the Public Library of Science, Hindawi, and Biomed Central, when we were getting the door shut in our face, almost literally, by talking about broader open access policies, crafting things like CC0 and sharing data on the web, and seeing the counter movements there. We've come a long ways since that, but also there were other elements such as, how we share biological materials and what can be done to help ease the sharing of code, but also, strains of materials that are used in biological settings that now are seen as so commonplace in so many other examples that recognizing that it wasn't that we were just coming up against resistance, it was necessary for that system to continue to, poke and inquire and evolve at a pace that we couldn't have necessarily fully anticipated, but it didn't mean that the ideas and the work was wrong.
I guess I think that some of the things that we've learned since around privacy, Uh, the difference between completely open sharing, radical openness, and the time, and the more nuanced issues. I mean, again, particularly at the moment in terms of the quality of information. Have we learnt those lessons yet, or are we still got some way to go?
It's interesting. I mean, I think it depends on what slice you're looking at. I'm very much of the mind that limiting downstream use of information, because there will always be instances where you can point to, what if you mix this data set with this data set and this data set, and it ends up having this negative consequence. I think that shouldn't necessarily always prohibit us from trying to figure out a way in which we can work towards creating different terms to work. And I think there's been some really exciting examples recently of looking at values and principles-based adherence to building systems that are starting to be tested out. Now, whether or not, like, what that looks like in terms of monitoring that adherence and making sure that it is not just used to secure funding or a place in the world, I think that's also something that I am especially interested in from an IOI perspective, of what can we do to help serve as not only a clearinghouse for better understanding and elevating the conversation about some of those principles and what it looks like in practice and the nuance there, because there is a lot of nuance, especially when you're talking about it in a business sense, but also be able to serve as a voice for understanding and being able to poke and prod and create, accountability mechanisms, to the extent the community can or has a taste for it, so that we can understand what that looks like. We're seeing this play out in Holland and with the deal with Elsevier that was being talked about earlier this week in terms of the national framework. We're seeing this in other places where we know there's a need to build new technology, but also trying to figure out, is that fully a not-for-profit endeavor, or is there a place to bring in other commercial players? So I think there's some really interesting questions there that we should be digging into, and IOI, I think, is exploring those right now.
So you went from being there at the beginning of building up science commons within this science activity within Creative Commons, and then you've also been involved in a number of other, right at the beginning of starting things up or scaling. So you moved to London to join digital science when it was just an idea. What was that experience like?
It was a really fascinating time. And I remember from those initial conversations about thinking through what additional supports can be applied in the broader scientific software space in terms of building out those tools. I mean, my role there in terms of managing not only external partnerships, but also helping to liaise with researchers and make sure that there were proper avenues, not only for feedback, but also building trust, as well as working with some of the researchers themselves that then began leading these businesses and building out software solutions to address their problems. To me, it was a really fascinating time to see how someone else was looking at addressing the problem. Now, in the early days when we were really building out what that looked like, we needed to iterate quite quickly on how we were approaching that. I remember from initial conversations anticipating that digital science was going to build 50% of the technology, and we were going to incubate another 50% of the technology. And then seeing the demand for, helping researchers who were scoping solutions to problems that they were deeply embedded in, and seeing what we could do to help. And so I think that there's some areas there that we can really learn from, and now seeing their broader successes, but also looking at where we can model that in terms of understanding the problem space, being unafraid to redirect our attention if we see that there is an area that is looking like it needs more support, and if we can uniquely provide value there. And so that to me was a really special time, at least in terms of that broader relationship with nature and within Macmillan, to really have that ability to operate as almost an R&D unit within.
Yeah, and I guess, again, so you're involved in the startup, engaged in the startup of a whole range of organizations, companies, services that grew out of that. and then also at Mozilla Science Labs, where you're building up, scaling up a new program of activity. What have you learned from that process of seeing these small organizations grow and succeed, and I guess in some cases not so much? Was that sort of the next step?
Yeah, it's a great question. I like tough problems. I like being able to see where we can join up and coordinate efforts and also address gaps in certain areas. I think each of these opportunities has kind of addressed a different space, a different area in the space. But I will say that what those opportunities have taught me is really to think through, the broader contingencies, for lack of a better word, for building out those bits of infrastructure. So, for example, the Mozilla Science work that led to creation of open leadership curriculum that's now being franchised out and used more broadly beyond science. It led to community mobilization across publishers, policymakers, researchers, technologists, etc. I think science is a really interesting incubation space where you, by nature of moving things forward, have to bring together these different perspectives. So it's not operating in isolation. And it even touches education and, for-profit technology and all of these sorts of areas, libraries, you name it. And so I have always had a bit of an interest in those emergent levels of interaction and development. I will say that kind of following on that work, really where I'm thinking now about sustainability at the other side of it, is recognizing that many of those initiatives, which are really important and critical to the development and the evolution of how we work as a society as well as a research enterprise, that the ways in which those enterprises are normally resourced is really brittle and quite fragile. And that led to, joining Wikimedia to build an endowment for Wikipedia and other free knowledge projects to see, okay, what if we were to really build out this use case and put some real money behind it, and build a $60 million endowment, which they have a $100 million goal and a 10-year challenge. So we're ahead of schedule on that side, but to really say, okay, when it comes to broader sustainability, can we start probing at some of those models? I think IOI is a natural evolution of that, to say, it isn't as black and white as grant funding, institutional home, or endowment. I think that there's a number of different areas there we can learn from other sectors and start to explore what it looks like to share resources, pool risk, understand what sort of technical support is needed to make sure that the infrastructures that we rely on, we're able to have them adapt to our needs, to really live with the broader, decisions that we make in terms of choosing open technology so that it can be iterative. But are we preparing ourselves to really take on the broader cost and foresight to be able to evolve them in the appropriate ways?
Yeah, so I guess that brings us back to invest in open infrastructure as the next step, which, as you said, you started on the day that the lockdown occurred in New York. Starting a new it wasn't hard enough to start up new organizations or to raise large sums of money. You had to start up a new organization in the middle of a pandemic. What does that look like right at the moment? And I guess the follow-on question: what happens next? What are the things that matter?
Yeah. So what I'm especially interested in right now, and if others are interested, please reach out. We'll be talking more about this over the coming weeks, is not only what the kind of in the immediate term, what are the pieces of infrastructure that we're currently seeing under strain that in the next 6 to 9 months would need an infusion of support. But also the fact that if you look forward to 12 to 18 months in higher ed and research enterprises, we are navigating through a significant amount of uncertainty. And the conversations that we've had with different university leaders, consortium members, infrastructure providers is really trying to kind of sketch out and do some of the scenario planning, as well as mapping some of the realities and the costs associated with some of these solutions to understand, okay, in 12 to 18 months, what level of infrastructure collapse could we be facing? across what levels and what dimensions? And can we, instead of having these bits of work done in isolation at a university by university level or institution by institution level, can we start to join forces, gather that information so we can get a broader understanding of not only the realities at these various places and what some of the dependencies and solutions are, but also where we can borrow from other, best case examples to not build something brand new, but also, iterate off of what might already exist to address some of these problems in a shared and collective way. And so that to me, I think is really fascinating, but also an area where, there's a broader understanding that scenario planning is needed. We're also being hit with, budget constraints and capacity issues. And I think IOI is uniquely positioned to help serve as a key support in that space.
So I guess as we come to the end of our time, if you wanted to leave people with one message, what would that one message be?
I would say that one message is the time to invest in a shared solution for the future of infrastructure is now. We are going to be hitting, drumming that conversation up over the next few weeks. If you're interested in being part of it, please get in touch.
So thank you. Thanks for joining me. Thanks
for your
time. Great to talk to you, as always. And for those watching, please continue to join us as we work through this schedule. And I still haven't got good at switching over to the splash slides. To join us for the rest of the series of Fireside Chats with myself and John Chodacki. I'm Cameron Neylon. I've been talking to Kaitlin Thaney from Invest in Open. You can see the rest of the schedule at openpublishingfest.org and go to the calendar link. And please join us for the rest of the calls with Jenny Hendricks, David Schott and Silvia Peroni, Amy Brand, and Claudio Aspesi. And we'll be wrapping up the festival at the end of next week with a reflection on all the chats we've had. So thanks for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this.